You will smile tonight, Eleanor, whatever you feel, the Duke of Oakmere said, drawing on his gloves. For the whole county is watching, and I will not have them pity my wife. He said it without turning, and so he did not see her face. He saw only his own reflection in the tall pier glass, and thought himself a man wholly in command of his evening. Julian Ashcombe, 7th Duke of Oakmere, was accustomed to command. He had it in the set of his shoulders, in the low, unhurried voice that made servants move before he finished speaking, in the way a crowded room seemed to arrange itself around wherever he chose to stand. He was 33 tall, dark, with the kind of stern beauty the poets of the age liked to call Roman, and he had never in his life been made to wait for anything he wanted. It had made him careless. He did not yet know that. Behind him in the glass, his wife rose from the little gilt chair by the window. Eleanor, Duchess of Oakmere, was slighter than the fashion admired, quiet where the age prized wit, and she carried herself with a stillness that some mistook for coldness and others for want of feeling. Julian had mistaken it for both at different times in the 2 years of their marriage. He had never once mistaken it for what it was, which was courage. "I mean only to do you credit," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I always do." "See that you do." He turned then at last and looked at her, the pearl-grey silk, the modest single strand of pearls at her throat, the dark hair drawn back without ornament. She was, he registered with a faint dissatisfaction he did not examine, perfectly correct and entirely unremarkable. Beside the memory that had been living lately at the edges of his mind, she seemed a sketch beside an oil. "The Fanshaws keep late hours," he added. "We shall not be home before 3. Wear the sable." He did not offer his arm. He never thought to. He walked ahead of her down the great staircase of Oakmere Court, and she followed, and the footmen bowed, and if any of them saw the small distance she kept behind him, none of them let it show. The occasion was the autumn ball at Fanshawe Park, the largest gathering the district would see before the roads turned to winter, and every family of any consequence for 30 miles had contrived an invitation. Oakmere was the greatest name among them, and so when the Duke's carriage rolled up the lamplit drive, heads turned at the windows, and the murmur ran ahead of him into the ballroom the way it always did. He was used to the murmur. He rather liked it. He handed his wife down without looking at her, and gave his hat and cloak to a servant, and did not notice that Eleanor stood a moment on the threshold gathering herself, as a person gathers themselves before cold water, before she went in at his side. The ballroom at Fanshawe Park blazed. 3 chandeliers, each a falling storm of crystal, threw a wash of candlelight down over a floor of polished oak. The long windows gave back the flames doubled. There were hothouse flowers banked against the pillars, though it was October, and the smell of them mixed with beeswax and powder and the faint sweetness of the champagne going round on silver trays. Julian moved into it as into his element. He was greeted and bowed to and drawn aside by this man and that. He answered a question about the price of wool and a question about the new turnpike bill and a question about his hounds, and he was aware, pleasantly, of his wife somewhere at his shoulder, saying the correct soft things to the wives. And then, across the room, he saw Camilla Vane. He had not known she would be here. He told himself that afterward, as though it mattered, that he had not sought it, that it had merely happened to him. It was a lie of the kind proud men tell themselves. Lady Camilla Vane, widowed now, back from 3 years in Bath, stood beneath the middle chandelier in a gown of deep wine-coloured velvet cut lower than the county was used to, and she was laughing at something with her head tipped back, and the candlelight ran along her white throat and her dark curls. And for the space of a breath Julian Ashcombe was 22 again, and standing in a garden he had not thought of in years. She had refused him once. That was the thing his careless heart had never quite forgiven and never quite forgotten, when he was young and not yet a duke, only the heir. With the old duke stubbornly alive, Camilla had been the beauty of the season, and Julian had wanted her with all the arrogant certainty of a young man who had never been denied, and she had laughed and married a richer, older man, because he could give her a house in town and Julian could give her only the future. It had wounded him more than he ever admitted. He had married Eleanor, in time, sensibly, for her lineage and her quiet, and her £12,000, and he had told himself he was content. Now Camilla lifted her eyes across the crowded room and found him, and did not look away. She smiled. It was a slow, knowing smile, and it's sanely a speech that she remembered too. He should have inclined his head and turned back to his wife. A wiser man, a kinder man, a man who had learned anything at all in 11 years, would have done exactly that. Julian crossed the room. "Lady Camilla," he said, and bowed over her hand, and held it a moment longer than the bow required. "Oakmere." Her voice had the same low ripple he remembered. "So it is true. They made you a duke. I confess I never thought you patient enough to wait for a dead man's shoes. I have grown patient in a great many things. Have you?" She looked up at him through her lashes. "I should like to see that." "I never knew you patient in anything," and she laughed and touched his sleeve, and the whole exchange had in it the ease of two people resuming a conversation only lately set down, and it drew eyes, it drew a great many eyes. The county had a long memory too. Somewhere behind him, Julian was distantly aware, his wife had gone very still. What followed he would spend a long time afterward trying to reassemble honestly, because at the time he saw so little of it. That was the whole horror of it. Later, how little he had seen. He knew only that he stayed. He knew that Camilla was amusing and flattering, and that being near her made him feel younger and finer and more admired than he had felt in longer than he cared to name, and that this was a pleasant sensation, and that he was a duke and might do as he pleased. So he stayed at her side. He fetched her champagne. He laughed at her wit. When the musicians struck up, he asked her to dance, and led her out into the middle of that bright floor beneath the falling crystal, and turned her under his hand, and the county watched the Duke of Oakmere dance twice with the widow Vane, while his young wife stood against the wall by the banked chrysanthemums unpartnered, her gloved hands folded, her chin level, watching. He danced a third time. He did not mean anything by it, he told himself. He simply did not think of Eleanor at all. It was old Lady Fanshawe who broke it in the end, and even then Julian did not understand what she was breaking. She came to him between dances, on her cane, a small, fierce, ancient woman who had known his mother, and she said, in a voice pitched for him alone, "Oakmere, your wife has been standing alone this hour, has she?" He glanced round mildly. Eleanor was where she had been. "She is not fond of dancing. She is not fond of being made a spectacle," said Lady Fanshawe, and the old eyes on him were not kind. "There is a difference, and a wiser man than your father would have taught it you. Go to her." He was a duke. He was not accustomed to being spoken to so, and something in him bridled at it. The vanity that had governed the whole evening rose up and told him he had done nothing wrong. That a man might speak to an old acquaintance, that his wife was making too much of nothing by her very stillness, that if she felt slighted she had only to come and stand beside him. He did not go to her at once. He let 5 more minutes pass to prove to whom? To himself that he was not commanded, and in those 5 minutes the thing happened that he would remember to the end of his life. Camilla, laughing, said something. He never afterward could recall the words, only their shape, and their shape was cruel. Something about the little grey mouse in the corner. Something about how the Duke had married sensibly and how one saw the sense of it, poor plain creature, standing there so patient. And Julian, this was the part that woke him, later sweating in the dark. Julian had smiled. He had not defended her. He had let the smile happen on his face, easy and complicit, in front of a dozen listening people. And one of the listening people had been near enough the wall that his wife might have heard. His wife had heard. He did not know it in the moment. He knew it a moment later, when he happened to look across the room and saw that Eleanor had left the wall. She was walking. Not hurrying, she never hurried, but crossing the floor toward the doors with a straight unhurried grace, her grey silk catching the candlelight, her head high, and something in the line of her back stopped the laughter in Julian's throat without his understanding why. She paused at the great doors. She turned. Across the whole width of that blazing, murmuring room, the Duchess of Oakmere looked at her husband, and it was not a look of tears, and it was not a look of anger, and that was what undid him, though he would not know he was undone for weeks. It was a look of decision. It was the look of a person who has weighed a thing carefully and found it wanting and set it down forever, and means never to pick it up again. She held his eyes for the length of one breath. Then she inclined her head to him, a small, perfect, courteous bow, the bow of a duchess taking leave, and she turned and went out through the doors into the dark and was gone. The doors did not slam. That was the thing. There was no scene, no raised voice, no scattered handkerchief for the gossips to retrieve. She simply walked out with her dignity gathered around her like the sable she had left on her chair, and the quietness of it was louder than any cry could have been. A little silence spread from the doorway outward across the room, the way a stone's ring spreads on water. Camilla's laugh, when it came, sounded thin. Julian stood with a glass in his hand and did not, for a full 10 seconds, move at all. Then something, pride, still mostly pride, for the eyes were on him, and a duke does not run after a departing wife like a chastened schoolboy, held him where he stood. He would not go out into the dark and be seen going. He would speak to her in the carriage. He would say reasonably that she had made too much of an evening's civility, that she had embarrassed them both by leaving, that a duchess did not sulk. He arranged the sentences in his mind. He set down his glass. He made his unhurried, dignified way toward the doors, nodding to this one and that, a man in no particular haste, and behind him he felt the whole room watching him go and getting the story it would tell for years. He came out onto the great steps, under a cold, high, clouded moon. The Oakmere carriage stood waiting at the foot, the lamps burning, the horses stamping in the frost. It was empty. Eleanor was not in it. "Where is the Duchess?" he said to the coachman, and heard for the first time an unfamiliar note in his own voice. The man touched his hat, uneasy. "Her Grace would not wait, Your Grace," she said, "begging your pardon. She said she'd sooner walk than ride, and she took the lane toward the village. I sent Thomas after her with a lantern. She would not be persuaded into the carriage." Julian stood on the steps of Fanshawe Park, in his evening clothes with the cold striking up through the soles of his shoes, and looked down the black lane where the little bobbing light of the footman's lantern was already small with distance, going away from him, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the peculiar hollow sensation of a man who has done something he cannot undo and does not yet understand. He stood on the steps a long time before he moved, and the cold came up through him, and behind him the ball went on. He could hear it. The music starting again, the murmur of voices to cover the small awkwardness of a duchess's departure, the world closing smoothly over the place where she had been, the way water closes. Someone laughed inside. It might have been Camilla. He found he did not want to go back in. The thought of that bright room, of the chandeliers and the flowers and the champagne and the clever, cruel woman under the middle light, filled him suddenly with something very like disgust, and he could not have said, standing there, whether the disgust was for the room or for himself, and would understand only much later that it was for himself, and that this was the first faint stirring of the thing that would remake him. He did go back in the end, because a duke could not stand on a doorstep all night, and because his cloak and his manners required it, and he made his farewells to the Fanshaws with a composure that cost him more than anyone knew. Old Lady Fanshawe gave him a hand at the door and did not smile, and said only low, "I hope you find her well, Oakmere." There was a whole sermon folded into the 4 words, and Julian bowed over the old hand and could not answer, and went out to his empty carriage. The ride home was 4 miles, and it was the longest 4 miles of his that point, though longer ones were coming. He sat in the dark with the empty seat before him and the lamps swinging and the frost stars wheeling past the window, and he tried at first to be angry. Anger was the familiar coat. He reached for it. She had embarrassed him. She had walked out of the county's greatest ball and left him standing, and the whole district would talk of it for a 12-month, and it was her doing, her drama, her want of sense. A wiser wife would have swallowed her feelings and smiled and had it out with him at home. He tried the anger on. It did not fit. It kept slipping off him, back onto the empty seat, and he kept seeing, instead of the wrong she had done him, the bow she had given him from the doorway, and the level chin, and the eyes that held no tears, and he could not make the anger stay, because underneath it, rising, cold and certain, was the knowledge that she had done nothing wrong at all, that she had borne, in dignity and silence, a public slight that no woman of spirit should have been asked to bear, and had answered it in the only way that left her honour whole, which was to remove her honour from the room, and that the fault, the whole of the fault, every particle of it was his. He did not want to know that. He fought it the whole 4 miles. But Julian Ashcombe had one virtue buried under all his vices, and it had lain dormant his whole easy life for want of any occasion to call on it. And the occasion had come at last. He was, at the very bottom of him, honest. Not honest in the small daily way. He had told himself comfortable lies for 30 years, but honest in the way that, cornered with the truth standing plainly before him in the dark, he could not, finally, look away from it. And so somewhere in the second mile, jolting through the frozen dark toward his great cold house, the Duke of Oakmere stopped fighting and let the truth come, and it came like Netherfold would come a month later, all at once over everything, and left nothing standing. He saw the whole evening again, and this time he saw it as she must have seen it, the arrival where he had handed her down without a look, the room where he had left her to make her own way, the sight of Camilla and his crossing the floor to her like a boy, the long hour at the widow's side while his wife stood by the flowers, the dances, 1, 2, 3, and the thing Camilla had said, the little grey mouse and his own smile, his own easy, complicit, unforgivable smile, spreading across his face where his wife could see it. He saw it. And something in him that had never been touched before was touched, and it was pain, real pain, the pain of shame, which he had never in his sheltered, arrogant life had cause to feel. And it was so unfamiliar and so sharp that for a moment he could not breathe with it. And he put his hand to the cold glass of the window and steadied himself, and the horses went on through the dark, carrying him home to the house where she would not be. By the time the Oakmere arch rose black against the stars ahead, he had made himself a promise, the first honest promise of his life, and he did not yet know that he would spend more than a year keeping it, and that it would cost him everything and give him back more than he had lost. He promised himself that he would not, whatever happened, whatever she did, whatever the county said, add to the wrong. He would not bluster, or blame her, or make it worse to save his pride. He did not, that night, know how to make it right. He did not yet even fully grasp all that was wrong. But he knew that much, that he must not make it worse, and he held to it. It was a small thing, as reformations go, a mere resolve not to do further harm. But great changes begin small. In the dark, in a jolting carriage, with a man too honest at the last to look away from what he has done. And this one began there, 4 miles from home, with an empty seat before him where his wife should have sat, and would end, more than a year later and 4 hours to the north. On his knees on a scrubbed floor with the winter sun falling gold across them both, he might have gone after her on foot. He considered it standing there in the frost. But a duke did not run down a dark lane in his dancing shoes, and pride, that faithful old servant, told him the thing was beneath him, that she would tire of her drama and be waiting cold and repentant at Oakmere Court by the time he arrived, and that he would forgive her generously. So he got into the empty carriage and rode home alone, and the leather seat opposite him where his wife should have sat stayed empty the whole 4 miles, and the emptiness of it began, very slowly, to work on him like a draught of cold air from a door he could not find and shut. Eleanor was not waiting at Oakmere Court. She had reached it before him, on foot, with Thomas and his lantern trailing anxious behind her, and she had gone straight up to her own rooms without a word to anyone. And by the time Julion's carriage rolled under the great arch and the sleepy footmen came out with their candles, her door was shut and the light beneath it was already out. He stood in the vast cold hall of his own house and looked up the staircase toward that dark line of door, and he did not go up. He told himself it was because the hour was late. In truth it was because, for the first time, he did not know what he would say if he stood before her, and a man who has never in his life been at a loss for what to say finds the sensation terrifying and disguises it, even from himself, as indifference. He slept badly. He woke before the servants, which he never did, and lay looking at the grey light coming grudging through the tall windows, and found that the scene at the ball would not leave him. He turned it this way and that, hunting for the version in which he had done nothing wrong, and he could not find it. He kept arriving instead at the bow, that small, courteous bow she had given him across the room. He had received 1,000 bows in his life and given 10,000 and never once felt one land on him like a blow, and this one had, and he lay in the grey light and understood, dimly and unwillingly, that a bow could be the coldest thing in the world when it came from someone who had decided to stop reaching for you. He rose. He dressed with unusual care, which he did not examine. He went down and asked the butler, with what he intended as unconcern, whether the Duchess had risen. Her Grace breakfasted early, your Grace, said old Marsh, and has gone out. She took the gig herself. Gone out where? She did not say, Your Grace. She was gone all that day. Julian filled it with the business of the estate, with letters and his steward and a tenant's dispute over a boundary hedge, and told himself he was not waiting, and waited. She came back at dusk. He heard the gig in the yard and rose from his chair by the library fire and then, absurdly, sat down again, so that when she passed the library door, he had left it open. She should not think he had been standing to receive her. She did not pass the library door. She went up the back stair. He heard, faint and far off, the sounds of a woman moving about her rooms, a drawer, a footstep, and he sat with an unread book and listened to the sounds of his own wife avoiding him in his own house, and the coal shifted in the grate, and the clock ticked, and he did not go up. At dinner they sat at the two ends of the long table, as they always had, with the length of polished mahogany and the branched candlesticks between them, and the servants coming and going, and Julian, who had passed 100 such dinners scarcely aware of her, found that he could look at nothing else. She was composed. She ate a little. She answered when he spoke, courteously, briefly, and volunteered nothing, and there was in her manner none of the reproach he had braced himself against, and he realized, half hoped for reproach would have been a door, a way in, a thing he could have answered and set right. There was only a great gentle finality, like a room in which the fire has gone out but the candles still burn. You left early, he said at last, when the servants had withdrawn between courses. He had meant it to sound like the opening of a reasonable conversation. It sounded in the great quiet room like an accusation, and he heard it too late. I did, said Eleanor. It was remarked. I dare say it was. She looked at him down the length of the table, and her grey eyes were steady. A great many things were remarked last night, Julian. I chose the one that was mine to choose. He had no answer to that, he, who always had an answer. He said stiffly, You made too much of an old acquaintance. Lady Vane is. I know who Lady Vane is. She said it without heat, and that was worse than heat. The whole county knows who Lady Vane is, and knew before I did, and was kind enough to explain it to me last night while I stood by the flowers. You need not trouble to tell me. She set down her fork. I am not angry with you, Julian. I want you to understand that, because I think you are waiting for me to be angry, and it will not come. I have been your wife for 2 years, and I have tried, in every way I knew, to be a good one, and last night I understood, finally and completely, that you do not want a good wife. You want an admiring one, and I find I cannot admire what I saw last night, and I will not pretend to, and I am too tired to be angry about it. That is all. The servants came back with the next course. Julian sat through it in a silence he did not know how to break, and by the time they were alone again the moment had closed over like water, and Eleanor rose and made him her small courteous bow, and went up to bed. He did not, in those first days, change. That is the truth of him, and he was honest enough, long afterward, not to soften it. His pride was a great old fortress, and it did not fall in a night. For the better part of a week he told himself that she was being unreasonable, that women were prone to these fits of injured feeling, that it would pass, that she would come round, that his part was to be patient and let her exhaust her sulk, and then to be magnanimous. He went on much as before. He rode out. He dined at his club 3 nights in a row, and if the men there looked at him a little sidelong, and if the story of the Fanshawe ball had plainly gone before him, he affected not to notice and drank his wine, and came home late and found her door dark. But the house had changed. That was the thing he could not order away with his pride. Oakmere Court had never been a warm house. It was too large and too grand and too full of dead ash combs staring down from their frames. But Eleanor's quiet presence in it had been, he discovered now by its subtraction, the one warm thing. He had never noticed it while it was there. Now he noticed everything. He noticed that the flowers in the hall, which he had never once thought about, were her doing, and that they had stopped being changed. The same roses stood in the same bowl until they dropped their petals on the marble. He noticed that the servants, who had always seemed to like her, moved through the rooms now with a subdued and watchful air, and that when he came into a room the small human sounds in it stopped, as though he were a cold draught they braced against. He noticed, above all, the piano. Eleanor played. He had known this the way he knew the colour of the drawing-room curtains, as a fact filed away and never regarded. She had played most evenings softly, in the small parlour off the hall, and he had passed the door 1,000 times on his way to somewhere more important and never once gone in. Now she did not play. The little parlour stayed dark, and the closed lid of the instrument gathered dust, and Julian found, to his own great surprise, that he missed a sound he had never troubled to hear. He caught himself pausing outside that dark door one evening, waiting for music that did not come, and he stood there a long moment like a fool before he understood what he was doing, and went on. It was in the second week that the loss began, in earnest, to do its slow work, and it began with a small thing, as such things do. He came in from riding one raw morning, chilled and out of temper, and went as he always did to the breakfast room, and found on the sideboard, keeping warm, the exact breakfast he liked, the eggs done as he liked them, the particular preserve he favoured, the coffee strong and hot, and it was only when he was halfway through it that a thought struck him with the force of a blow. He had never once ordered any of this. In 2 years he had never given a single instruction about his breakfast. Someone had learned, silently, over 2 years, precisely how he liked every small thing, and had seen to it every single morning without his knowing, and had never asked for thanks or seemed to want them. And that person had gone quiet, and was leaving him, and he had eaten 200 perfect breakfasts and thanked her for none of them. He put down his fork, the coffee cooled in the cup. He sat for a long time in the empty breakfast room while the fire settled, and something in the great old fortress of his pride, deep down where the light did not reach, gave a small, first, ominous shift. The next Sunday he did a thing he had not done in months, which was to go to church. And he went because it was expected of the Duke of Oakmere, because he could not bear another morning alone in the house, and he sat in the great front pew that his family had sat in for 6 generations, and Eleanor's place beside him was empty, and the whole congregation saw that it was empty, and Julian sat under the weight of their not-quite glances and understood, kneeling and rising and kneeling, that a man's sins do not stay private, that they take up residence in the spaces he has emptied, that an empty pew can preach a longer sermon than any parson. The rector preached that morning on the parable of the man who had all things and lost the one thing needful, and Julian could not decide whether it was chance or whether the good man had aimed it, and either way it went into him like a splinter and stayed. He rode home slowly. The bells were ringing behind him across the frozen fields, and he thought about the word needful, and about how he had spent his whole life surrounded by things that were merely wanted, and had let the one needful thing stand 2 years by the flowers, unregarded, until it walked out into the dark. That was the winter he stopped dining at his club. He found he could not sit among the men there any longer, hearing them talk as he had used to talk, with the same easy contempt for anyone smaller than themselves, the same appetite for the story of another man's downfall, and understand that he had been one of them, indistinguishable a fortnight before, and that they still counted him one of them, and would go on doing so however he changed, because they could not imagine that a man of their number might come to despise the very thing that made him one of them. He made his excuses. He rode home through the cold instead, and sat alone with the Ledgers, and was better company to himself than they had ever been. His sister wrote to him from Bath, Lady Sophia, married, comfortable, 3 years his elder, the only living soul who had ever spoken to him without either fear or flattery. She had heard, of course. Everyone had heard. Her letter was short, and it was not gentle. "You have done a monstrous, stupid thing, Julian," she wrote, "and I will not pretend otherwise to spare your feelings, since your feelings were the whole trouble to begin with, being always the only feelings you consulted. Eleanor is worth 10 of you, and you have known it since you married her and could not forgive her for it, which is the smallest, meanest thing I know of any man, and I am ashamed to be your sister this month. There. Now I will tell you the one useful thing, which is that she is not a woman who can be flattered or bought or frightened back, so do not try any of the 3, or you will lose her past mending. If there is anything in you but the varnish I have always suspected, this is the year the world will find it out. I hope for both your sakes there is. Your loving and disgusted sister, he read it 3 times. Then, instead of the hot reply the old Julian would have sent within the hour, he sat with it a long while, and found that every word of it was just, and wrote back only this: "You are right in every particular. I am trying to be something other than varnish. I do not know yet whether I shall manage it. Do not tell me I can. I have been told all my life that I could do anything I pleased, and it has been the ruin of me. Only wish me the strength to keep trying whether I manage it or not. Jay and Sophia, reading that in Bath, put the letter down and looked at it a long moment, and said aloud to her empty morning room, well, perhaps there is a man in there after all, and did not tell him so, because she was wiser than that, and only wrote back that she wished him strength, which was the truest kindness she knew how to give. The house grew quieter and quieter as the winter deepened. The servants, who had at first been merely subdued, grew watchful of him in a new way, not the old worriness of a hard master, but something almost like a cautious hope, for they had loved the Duchess and grieved her going, and they saw the Duke changing, and did not know what to make of it, and watched to see if it would hold. Old Marsh, the butler, who had served the family 40 years and buried the last Duke, and was afraid of no living man, took it upon himself one December evening to say, setting down the decanter that Julian had not touched, "If I may speak, Your Grace." And Julian, who a year before would have frozen him with a look for the presumption, said only, "You may, Marsh. God knows someone in this house ought to speak to me honestly. I have had too little of it in my life and too much of it lately, and I am the better for the latter." "It is only, Your Grace," said the old man, and his voice was not quite steady, "that the household would take it very kindly to know whether whether there is any hope she might return. The maids ask me. I do not know what to tell them. We were all of us fond of her, Your Grace, if you will forgive my saying so. She never raised her voice to one of us in 2 years, and she remembered every name, and she nursed young Peg through the quinsy herself when we thought the girl would die. The house has not been the same. I do not say it to reproach you." He stopped, having plainly said more than he meant to. "You do not reproach me half so much as I reproach myself," said Julian quietly. "I do not know if she will return, Marsh. I have no right to expect it, and I am trying to teach myself to want her good more than her return, which is the hardest lesson I have ever set myself. Tell the maids the truth, that her Grace is well and happy and much beloved in the north, and that whether she comes back rests entirely with her and not at all with me, as it ought always to have. And tell them," his voice caught and he mastered it, "tell them that this house was better for her being in it, and I know it at last, and that I am ashamed it took her going to teach me." Marsh bowed, and there was a brightness in the old eyes that had not been there when he came in. And he went out, and Julian sat alone with the untouched decanter and the settling fire, and thought that he had just spoken more honestly to his butler than he had ever spoken to his wife in 2 years of marriage, and that this was itself the measure of how wrong he had gone, and how far he had to go. She told him a fortnight after the ball in the library on a wet grey afternoon, and she chose her moment and her words with the same care she had always brought to everything, and it took her under a minute. "I am going to Wexham," she said. Julian looked up from his letters. Wexham was the small dower manor at the far northern edge of the Oakmere lands, a plain grey house of no great size, tenanted these last years by a widowed cousin who had lately died. "Wexham," he repeated. "It is empty now, since Cousin Harriet died," said Eleanor. "It is mine to use. It was settled on me at our marriage, you will remember. Among the marriage articles you did not read closely. A very faint dryness there, and then gone. I mean to live there, quietly. I have written to Mr. Pennant, his own steward, and the arrangements can all be made without troubling you. I shall take only Bessie and old Coombs and the mare. You need do nothing but not prevent me, and I do not think you will prevent me, because to prevent me you would have to make a scene, and you dislike scenes even more than I do." He had risen. He did not remember rising. "This is absurd," he said. "You are the Duchess of Oakmere. You cannot rusticate in a dower house like a discarded wife." She said it for him quietly, and let it sit between them, and he flushed, because that was exactly the word that had risen to his tongue, and exactly the thing he did not want said aloud. "I am not asking for a separation, Julian. There will be no scandal beyond what you made yourself at the ball, and that will die down, as these things do, once I am safely out of sight, and there is nothing to look at. You may tell the county I am nursing my health in the country. You may tell them whatever you please. I am only asking to be allowed to stop." She drew a slow breath. "I am tired of standing by the flowers. I would rather stand somewhere alone than be alone standing beside you. That is the whole of it. And if I forbid it? It came out of him before he could stop it, the old reflex of command, and he hated the sound of it even as he spoke, and hated more the small sad way she smiled. Then I will stay, she said, and be your duchess, and do you credit before the county, and change the flowers in the hall, and play the piano when you have guests to impress, and you will have a wife again of a sort, and we will both know exactly what she is worth to you, which is nothing, and I do not think, Julian, that even you want that. You are proud. You are not, I think, at the bottom of you cruel. There is a difference, and I have been counting on it. Let me go. He let her go. He never afterward decided whether it was mercy or cowardice, or simply that he could find no sentence to stop her with. But he stood in his library and let his wife arrange her own exile, and 3 days later a plain travelling coach went out under the Oakmere arch in the rain with 2 trunks on it and Eleanor's grave face at the window, and old Coombs on the box. And Julian watched it from the library window and did not go down to the yard, and told himself it was for the best, and did not believe himself, and knew he did not believe himself, which was new. The house without her was insupportable, and he could not think why, since she had been so quiet a presence that whole days had used to pass without his marking her. He found the answer slowly, over the empty weeks. It was that he had been able to disregard her because she had been there to disregard. A man may lean without knowing it on a wall he never looks at, take the wall away and he falls, and only then, sprawled, learns it was holding him up. Julian had leaned on Eleanor's steadiness, her order, her uncomplaining competence, her forgiveness for 2 years, taking each of them for the natural condition of the world, and now the wall was in Wexham and he was learning, joint by joint, how much of him it had been carrying. He grew short with the servants and knew it was unjust and could not stop. He rode out in all weathers. He went up to town for a fortnight, thinking to lose himself in the season, and found the season a great glittering noise with nothing at the centre of it. Lady Camilla Vane was in town. She made it known, through the usual channels, that she would receive him. He went once. He sat in her handsome hired drawing-room and watched her be exactly as charming as she had been at the ball, and heard her make exactly the same kind of clever, unkind remark about someone not present, and saw, with a clarity that was almost physical, like a mist lifting off a field, what she was, and what he had nearly ruined himself for, and what it had cost. She was a fine-cut jewel with nothing behind it. She flattered his vanity, and she had never once, in all the hours of his knowing her, thought a single kind thought about a single living soul, and he had wrecked a good and gentle marriage to dance with her 3 times under a chandelier. He got up before the tea was cold, and made his excuses and left, and did not call again, and Camilla, who understood men better than she understood anything else, did not pursue it. She had wanted to be pursued. She had no use for a man who had woken up. He came back to Oakmere in a black frost of self-knowledge, and it was there, in the dead of that winter, alone in the great house with the dead Ashcombe staring down, that Julian Ashcombe finally did the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding, which was to look at himself honestly and dislike what he saw. He had been a fortunate man and had mistaken his fortune for merit. He had been given rank and wealth and a handsome face and a clever tongue, and had done nothing to earn any of it, and had spent it all his life on his own gratification, and had called this being a duke. He had married a woman finer than himself and had never once seen her, because to see her would have required him to look up from his own reflection, and he had preferred his reflection. He had let a cruel woman he did not even love insult his wife to his face, and he had smiled. And the reason he had smiled, this was the coldest stone at the bottom of it, and he made himself pick it up and hold it. The reason he had smiled was that some small mean part of him had been flattered to have 2 women in a room minding what he did, and had enjoyed his wife's plain patience being made to seem plainer by Camilla's shine. He had traded Eleanor's dignity for the pleasure of feeling admired. It was the act of a small man, and he was not accustomed to thinking himself a small man, and the discovery went through him like frost through stone, splitting. He did not, even then, immediately ride north to fling himself at her feet. He was too changed for that, and not changed enough. He understood. This was the first real fruit of his self-knowing, that an apology was worth nothing, that he could go to Wexham and be eloquent and abject, and it would move her not at all, because she had heard him be eloquent before and had learned exactly what his fine words were worth, which was the price of an evening's amusement. She did not need to hear that he was sorry. Anyone could be sorry. Sorrow was cheap. Sorrow was only a wish that the consequences would go away. What she needed, if she needed anything from him, which he was no longer sure of, was to see that he had become a different man, and that could not be said. It could only be shown over time by 100 acts, with no promise of reward, and he was not certain he had it in him. That was the honest terror at the center of his reckoning, that he had discovered, too late, what he owed, and might not be man enough to pay it. He began that winter in small ways and told no one, because to be seen reforming would have made it a performance, and he was done with performances. He read the marriage articles, all of them closely, as he should have done 2 years before, and found in them 100 small evidences of a good faith he had never returned. He went for the first time in his life over the estate accounts himself and found that Eleanor, quietly, without a word to him, had for 2 years been paying out of her own settled income for things he had let fall: the mending of the almshouse roof in the village, the schooling of 2 orphan boys of a dead gamekeeper, the pension of an old nurse he had entirely forgotten. She had been doing his duty for him, in secret, and letting him take the credit of a great and generous house, and had never told him, because to tell him would have been to reproach him, and she did not reproach. He sat with the ledgers open before him in the cold library and put his face in his hands, and was glad there was no one to see the Duke of Oakmere so. There was a night, deep in that first winter of her absence, that Julian never spoke of to anyone and never forgot. A great storm came down off the moors, the worst in 20 years, and it brought a flooding though behind it. And word came up to the court near midnight that the river had risen, and the low bridge at Netherfold was under water, and a carter and his beasts were stranded on the far side in the dark with the flood climbing. Once Julian would have sent men. That night he went himself in the rain, on his best horse, with lanterns and ropes and half the male household behind him, and he stood to the waist in the black icy water among his own tenants, and helped haul the terrified carter and his horses to safety by main strength, and did not once, in the whole cold, desperate hour, think about who was watching or how it looked, because there was no one to impress in the roaring dark, only a man to save, and he saved him. He rode home before dawn, soaked and shaking and half frozen, and he was more nearly happy than he had been in months. And he lay in his bath while the grey light came up and understood the strange thing that had happened to him in the flood, that for 1 whole hour he had entirely forgotten himself, forgotten the Duke of Oakmere altogether, forgotten his rank and his shame and his loss, and had simply been a pair of strong hands in the dark where strong hands were needed, and that this forgetting of himself had been the purest pleasure he had ever known, purer than any pleasure the old Julian had chased in a lifetime of chasing. He thought of Eleanor up at Wexham sitting the 2 nights with the Barlow child, and he understood, for the first time, what she had found in it, and why she was happy, and he envied her, and he wanted, with a sudden fierce clean wanting, to be the kind of man who was good not to be seen good, but because the good wanted doing, and he saw that she had been that kind of person the whole time he had known her, quietly, in his own house, paying the almshouse and schooling the orphans out of her own purse and letting him take the credit, and that he had lived beside a saint for 2 years and called her plain. He kept the flood to himself. But the tenants did not, and it went the rounds, as everything did, and it went north, and it was one of the first things that reached Wexham of the changed Duke, that he had gone into the Netherfold flood himself at midnight and hauled a carter out by his own arms. Eleanor, hearing it, said nothing, and went very quiet, and went out alone into a frozen physic garden, and stood a long while in the cold looking south, and came in with red eyes and told Bessie it was the wind. The good works of the Duke of Oakmere multiplied through that first year, and the thing that gave them their weight, the thing the county slowly came to see, was that he claimed none of them and refused all thanks. When the endowment of the almshouse was done, and the grateful old folk a little address of thanks to be read to him, he would not receive it. He sent word that the thing had wanted doing this 30 years, and its being done was thanks enough, and they were to say no more about it. When he apprenticed the gamekeeper's orphans and the elder boy came to the court cap in hand to thank his grace, Julian took the boy's hand and shook it like a man's and said, "Do not thank me. Learn your trade and be honest, and when you are a master someday, take an orphan boy apprentice of your own without being asked, and that will be thanks, and nothing else will." The boy told that in the village, and it was much repeated, and it did the Duke more good in the county than £100 of charity done for show, because the county, for all its love of a scandal, could tell the true coin from the false, and knew that a man who refuses thanks has stopped doing his good for himself. He was lonely in a way he had never been lonely in his life, and he made himself not run from it, because he had come to understand that the loneliness was teaching him. He had never in his life been alone with himself for long. There had always been company and admiration, and the pleasant noise of being the finest man in the room. Now the rooms were empty and the noise was gone, and there was only Julian Ashcombe, and the long evenings and the dead Ashcombes in their frames, and he sat with himself night after night, and got to know the man he had been avoiding for 33 years, and found him poor company at first, and then, slowly, over the months found him improving, because a man who will sit honestly with himself and not look away does, in time, become someone he can bear to sit with, and Julian was, for the first time, doing the honest sitting. He began to read, really to read, not the light stuff he had used to skim. He read the great old books on his own dusty shelves that generations of Ashcombes had bought for show and never opened, and found in them, to his surprise, a company that did not flatter him. Dead wise men who told him plainly across the centuries what a small thing vanity was and what a great thing constancy. And he wore a path to the library and sat up late with a single candle and read, and it was in a book of old sermons, one bitter January night, that he came on a line he copied out in his own hand and kept. "It is a light thing to be sorry for a wrong. The weight of a man is in whether he will pay for it without hope of thanks." He pinned it inside the lid of his writing desk, where only he would see it, and read it every morning, and measured his days by it, and told no one it was there. The spring that brought news of Eleanor's flowering in the north brought also, to Julian, a kind of settled purpose that steadied him. He had feared, in the black weeks, that his changing was only grief, that when the grief wore off he would go back to being the man of the ball, and he watched himself for it warily. But the grief did wear, in time as grief does, softening from an open wound to a permanent quiet he carried and grew used to, and the changed man underneath did not go back. That was how he knew it was real. The good works did not stop when they stopped hurting. The honest self-sitting did not stop when the loneliness eased. The humility did not fall away the moment his pride began cautiously to heal. He was simply a different man than he had been. Built new in the empty house out of loss and labor, and the long honest nights, and the deepest astonishment of his life was that he liked the new man better, that he would not have gone back to being the Duke of the Ball for any price the world could name, that Eleanor's walking out had cost him everything he thought he valued and given him, in the wreckage, the only thing he had ever truly needed, which was a self he was not ashamed of, and the bitterest sweetness of it, the thing he turned over and over on the sleepless nights, was that he owed the whole of it to her goodness and her courage, and above all to leaving, and that he might never be able to tell her so, and that even if he never could, it would still be true, and she would still have made him, and that would have to be enough, and some nights. But help him, it very nearly was. Spring came slowly to the north that year, and with it came from Wexham the first news of what Eleanor was becoming. Julian did not seek it. He had resolved not to intrude on her, that much at least of what she asked he could give. And so he had no letters from her and sent none, and he learned of her the way the county learned of her, sidelong in fragments, through the servants and the tenants, and the talk that ran along the lanes. And what the talk said that spring was that the Duchess of Oakmere, up at the little grey house of Wexham, had quietly become the making of the whole northern quarter of the estate. He heard it first from Pennant, his steward, who came to him one April morning with the rents and mentioned, as though it were nothing, that the North farms were paying better than they had in a decade. "Her Grace has a way with the tenants, your Grace," the man said, not meeting his eye, for the whole household walked carefully around the subject of the Duchess. "She has had the drainage done on the low fields at Wexham out of her own purse, and shown Kettle and the others how it might be managed on their own ground, and they have taken to her. She rides out among them herself. She sat up 2 nights with the Barlow child in the fever, and it lived, and now there is not a family in the North Quarter would hear a word against her. He hesitated. They have taken to calling her the good Duchess, your Grace, in the North. I thought you would wish to know. Julian sat very still behind his desk. The good Duchess. Not proud, not grand, not the Duke's cast-off wife rusticating in a dower house. The good Duchess, made so by her own hands in a single hard winter, in a place he had sent her to be forgotten. He thanked Pennant and dismissed him, and sat along while looking at the ledger, and felt something he had never in his life expected to feel toward his quiet grey wife, which was awe. It grew through that spring and summer, the news of her, and every piece of it was another stone laid on the scale against him. She started a small school at Wexham in an old barn, and taught the letters herself 2 mornings a week, and the tenants' children came who had never had a lesson in their lives. She restored the physic garden at the Grey House, and made simples and salves and carried them herself to the sick. And there began to be, along the northern lanes, the beginnings of a kind of love for her, the plain, deep love of country people for someone who has proved, in the mud and the cold, that she means it. She was becoming, in her exile, entirely herself, unfolding in the away from him into a woman of such steady usefulness and grace that the county, which had pitied her at the Fanshawe ball, began within the year to speak of her with a respect it did not always extend even to Julian, and there began to be, at first in whispers, and then not only in whispers, a question abroad in the district that was very hard for a proud man to hear. What could the Duke of Oakmere have been about, to slight a woman like that? He heard the question. He deserved it. He did not defend himself, which surprised the county, who had expected the Duke to bluster, and did not know that the Duke had passed a winter learning to hold his tongue and hear the truth. And with every piece of good news of her, a strange thing happened to Julian, which he had not foreseen and could not at first name. He was glad. Beneath the grief and the shame and the great slow ache of missing her, he found, when he examined it honestly, a clean unmixed gladness that she was well, that she was flourishing, that she had found in the ruin he had made of their marriage a soil to grow in. He wanted her to be happy. He discovered, turning it over in the long evenings, that he wanted her to be happy even if it were forever apart from him, even if he never won her back, even if the price of her flowering was that she was flowering away from him and would never come home. And the day he discovered that in himself was the day he understood, with a quiet that was almost peace, that he had at last begun to love her, because that, he saw now, was what he had never done at the ball, nor before it. To want someone's admiration is not to love them, it is only a finer sort of vanity. To want their good more than your own, to be glad of their thriving even when it costs you everything, that was the thing he had heard about all his life in sermons and songs and never believed in, and here it was, grown up in the wreckage, too late, and pointed north. He began to court her then. But he did it in the only way she had left him, which was the true way and the hard way and the way with no guarantee. He did not write her love letters. She would have known what they were worth. He did not send her jewels. She had left the Oakmere diamonds in their case when she went, untouched. Instead, he took up at Oakmere the duties he had for 2 years let her quietly carry, and he did them himself, and he did them without a word to her, so that she should not think it a performance for benefit. He mended the almshouse properly, and endowed it. He found the 2 orphan boys she had schooled and put them apprentice to good trades and paid the fees himself. He went out among his own tenants in the South Quarter, as she had gone out among hers in the North, awkwardly at first, for he had never done it and did not know how, and he learned. He sat one raw night with a sick shepherd, holding a lantern for the surgeon, because it was the thing that wanted doing, and there was no one else, and rode home at dawn stiff and filthy and strangely, fiercely content. He was, without saying so, trying to become the kind of man who would have deserved her on the chance, the slender, unpromised chance, that if he ever stood before her again he might have something to show that was not words. Word of it went north, as word of her had come south, along the same lanes and the same fragments. He did not send it. He could not have stopped it. The country is small and the servants talk, and by midsummer it had reached Wexham that the Duke of Oakmere had grown strange and quiet and good. that he laboured among his people, that he had turned away the widow vain in town before the hall of society, that he changed the flowers in the great hall himself now, with his own hands, twice a week, which the maids reported as though it were the most astonishing thing in the world. And perhaps it was. Whether it moved Eleanor, Julian had no way to know and did not let himself hope it did. He had resolved on one thing in his long winter, and he held to it through the spring and the summer with a discipline that would have astonished the careless man of the ball. He would not go to her. He would not present himself at Wexham with his fine new humility and ask to be forgiven, because that would only be one more thing he was doing for himself, one more claim on her, and she had had enough of his claims. He would do the work, and let the work be its own reward whether she ever came or not, and leave the next move, if there were ever to be a next move, entirely to her. She had walked out of his life with dignity and by her own free choice, and if she were ever to walk back into it, it would have to be by that same free choice, or it would be worth nothing, and he had learned at last, and at a price he would be paying for the rest of his life, exactly what things were worth. So he waited and worked and did not write, and the summer turned, and he told himself he expected nothing, and lay awake at night in the great house listening for a piano that no longer played, and every day twice, with his own hands, he changed the flowers in the hall. There came to him that summer a piece of news from the north that tried his hard-won resolve harder than anything yet, and it was this, that Eleanor had been ill. It reached him through Pennant, who had it from the Wexham steward, and it was already old news by the time it came, weeks old. A fever caught in one of the fever rooms she would insist on sitting in. That had laid her low a fortnight and frightened the whole north quarter, and then, thank God, broken and past and left her weak, but mending. But Julian, hearing it in the safe past tense, felt the whole of it as though were happening in that instant, felt his wife burning with fever in a plain grey house 4 hours away while he sat safe and ignorant at Oakmere, felt that she might have died up there alone, that she might have died and he would have been the last to know, that she might have slipped out of the world still thinking herself unloved by her husband, and he was on his feet with his hand already reaching for the bell to order his horse before he caught himself, gripping the mantel, and made himself stop. For this was the very test, was it not? This was exactly the moment the old grasping man would seize on, a woman ill and frightened, defences down in need, to rush north with his devotion and his fine feeling and press himself back into her life, while she was too weak to refuse him, and it would be for himself. It would be to ease his own terror, to have the comfort of doing something, of being at her bedside, of being needed and forgiven. It would not be for her. She had a household that loved her, and skilled care, and she was already mending. His arriving now would give her nothing but a scene she was too weak to manage, and it would take from her the very thing he had sworn to leave her, which was her freedom to choose him or not with a clear head and a whole heart. To go to her now would be to take advantage of her weakness to force the question, and he would rather have died, he found, than do that to her, and the finding of that in himself was one more small proof that the man of the ball was truly gone. So he did not go. It was the hardest not going of his life, harder than the whole long year of not reaching, and he did it. He sent, instead, quietly, and without his name attached, the best physician in the county northward, arranged through Pennant as though it were the steward's own doing, with orders to attend her grace and want for nothing and send no bill anywhere but to the court. And he sent up from the Oakmere hothouses the first of the season's grapes and peaches, the things that tempt a sick appetite, again with no card, no name. Nothing she could trace to him and feel beholden by, and then he sat at Oakmere and waited, in an agony he told no one, for the word that she was truly out of danger, and when it came at last, mending, sitting up, out of her bed, walking in the garden again, he went down to the empty chapel at the end of the west wing where the family christenings and burials were held, and knelt on the cold stone alone, and gave thanks plainly like any frightened husband, and stayed there a long time. Eleanor, up at Wexham, mending, was puzzled by the physician who would take no fee and the fruit that came with no card, and being a clever woman she was not puzzled long. She said nothing. But she kept the empty basket the peaches had come in, which was a foolish thing to keep, and Bessie found it later on a high shelf, and could not think why her grace would not let it be thrown out, and her grace did not explain. The autumn of that first year brought the fair at Harborne, and the meeting in the market square, which Julian carried home like a live corpse in his hands, half afraid to look at it lest it burn out. The twice she had called him Julian, the colour in her cheek, the long searching look. He fed on it in secret through the shortening days and would not let himself build on it, and held to his resolve not to write, not to go, not to reach. And it was the hardest autumn of the whole hard business, because the meeting had woken hope, and hope is a far crueler companion than despair. Despair, at least, lets a man rest. Hope keeps him at the window. But he had learned by now what he had never known before, which was how to want a thing patiently and leave it free. And so through that autumn and into the second winter he did the only thing his hard-won wisdom allowed. He went on. He went on with the works and the honest sitting and the reading and the running of the estate as it had never been run in his careless days, and he let his love for her burn low and steady and unspoken, a banked fire rather than a blaze, and he made his peace as well as a man can, with the real possibility that this banked fire was all he would ever have of her, that she might live out her life at Wexham, beloved and free and content, and that he might live out his at Oakmere, mended and useful and alone, and that they might grow old 4 hours apart, each the making of the other's better self, and never come together again, and that this too would be a kind of love, incomplete and aching, but real and more than he deserved. He thought he had reconciled himself to it. He had not, of course. No man reconciles himself to such a thing, but he had got far enough with the pretense to live, and it was in that state, quiet, laborious, banked, resigned to a lifetime of loving her at a distance, that the news of the Marchmonts reached him in the 2nd December and broke his careful peace to pieces, and set him walking the long gallery in the dark, fighting the last and hardest battle of his change, whether at the very end, with everything to lose, he would reach for her at last to save himself, or whether he had truly become the man who could open his hand and let her go free even now, even into another's keeping, even forever. He walked till the black windows cried, and by the grey dawn he had his answer, and rode north to give her away. It was chance that brought them face to face again, or what men call chance, a thing neither of them contrived, in a place neither of them chose, so that when it came there could be no accusation of design on either side, and Julian was afterward absurdly grateful for that. There was a great cattle fair and gathering at Harborne, the market town that sat between the north and south quarters of the Oakmere lands, held every year at the turn of summer into autumn, and the Duke was expected at it, as his father's had been, to sit at the head of the ordinary dinner and hear the tenants' business and give the prizes for the beasts. He had gone every year and been bored by it and left early. This year he went early and stayed late and knew the name of every man he spoke to, because he had spent a year learning them. And the Duchess of Oakmere, it happened, was there too, for the North tenants were her people now, and would no more have gone to Harborne without her and without their own right hands, and she came in among them quietly, in a plain grey pelisse. And there was a little cheer went up along the north side of the market square when she came, low and warm, and entirely without ceremony, the sound of people glad to see someone they loved. Julian heard the cheer before he saw her, and knew, by some sense he had grown that year, exactly what it meant, and turned, and there she was across the square, and his heart did a thing in his chest that he had not felt since he was 22 in a garden, and this time it was aimed at the right person, 11 years too late. She had changed. Not greatly, to a stranger's eye. She was still slight, still grave, still plainly dressed, but Julian, who had at last learned to look at her, saw that the year in the north had done to her what it had failed to do to him easily. It had finished her. She stood among her people with a sure, kind, unhurried authority that no rank could have given her and that she had earned in the mud and the fever rooms, and there was a colour in her that the great cold house had never let her have, and when she smiled at the Barlow woman who ran up to her with a child on her hip, the smile was the freest thing Julian had ever seen, and he understood, watching it from across the square, that he had married a rare and beautiful soul and had kept it in the dark for 2 years and never once made it smile like that, and that another man might, and that this was no more than he deserved. They could not, in a small square in a small town where every soul knew them both, avoid meeting. He saw her see him. He saw the small still moment in which she gathered herself, exactly as she had gathered herself on the threshold of the Fanshawe ball, and the memory of that other gathering went through him like a knife. Then she came across the square to him, because she would not be seen to snub her husband in public any more than she would be seen to fawn, and she stopped a correct distance from him and made him a small courteous bow, that bow, the bow that had unmade him. "Your Grace." "Your Grace," he answered and bowed, and for a moment the careless Duke of the Ball, who had always had something clever to say, stood struck entirely dumb. Because there was so much he needed to say, and no possible way to say the smallest part of it, across 4 feet of muddy cobblestone with 100 tenants watching. "You have come early to the fair," she said, to fill the silence, and there was nothing in her voice but courtesy, and the courtesy was a wall. "I come every year now," he said. "I stay to the end." "There is more to it than I used to think." He heard how flat it sounded, how far from what he meant, and he did not try to make it finer, because he had learned that his fine words were the very thing she distrusted. "The North tenants speak well of you," he added low. "The whole county speaks well of you. I am glad of it, Eleanor. I want you to know that I am glad of it, with no reservation. You have done a great deal of good." Something crossed her face then, very quickly, gone almost before he saw it, surprised perhaps, that he had said the thing so plainly and claimed no credit, and asked for none. "Thank you," she said, after a moment, and it was the first thing she had said to him all day that was not merely a wall. "The people here are easy to love. I have been happy among them." "I am glad," he said again, and meant it so wholly that his voice was not quite steady, "that you have been happy." She looked at him. It was a long look, and a searching one. The look of a woman weighing a thing she had not expected to have to weigh, and Julian stood still under it, and let her look and did not perform, did not soften his face into contrition or arrange himself into a picture of a reformed man. He only stood there, tired and plain and honest, and let her see whatever was there to be seen, and whatever she saw it made her drop her eyes at last and a faint colour come into her cheek, and she said, more quickly than before, "I must go. The Kettle children are looking for me. Good day to you, Julian." And she was gone back across the square to her people, and Julian stood where she had left him and found that his heart was going like a hammer and that he was, for the first time in a year, and against all his careful resolutions, hoping. He tried to crush the hope, because he had learned that hope was one of the ways a man serves himself instead of another, but it would not be crushed, because she had called him Julian. Twice she had called him Julian, in the middle of a public square, when she might have kept to "Your Grace" and been perfectly correct and perfectly cold, and she had called him by his name, and there had been that colour in her cheek, and Julian, riding home from Harborne that evening through the long gold light with the dust of the fair on him, let himself hope for the length of the ride, and it was the sweetest and most frightening thing he had felt in a year. But he held to his resolve. He did not go to Wexham. He did not write. He understood more clearly than ever after that meeting in the square that everything now depended on his not grasping, on his leaving her free, on his letting her come to him if she ever would and never once reaching out to pull. It was the hardest thing he had ever set himself. Harder than the labour, harder than the humility, this daily discipline of not reaching toward the one thing in the world he now wanted, and he held to it through the autumn. And the leaves came down over the north road and the south, and no word came from Wexham, and slowly, as the year closed in, the hope that the fair had lit in him began, despite everything, to gutter. The dark hour came at the turn of the year, and it came as these things do, disguised at first as good news. It reached him at Oakmere in December from Pennant, and it was this: that the Duchess had been so successful and so beloved at Wexham that a proposal had been got up among certain of the great families of the north, the Marchmonts chiefly, who had a rich unmarried son and a great sense of their own consequence, to draw her permanently into their own circle. There was talk, Pennant said, uneasy, that if the Duke and Duchess were to be forever estranged, and if in time the marriage were to be quietly dissolved, as such things sometimes were among the great, then the Duchess, being still young, and now so admired, and possessed of her own settled fortune and lands, would be a match any family would be proud of, and that young Marchmont was much at Wexham of late on this pretext and that, and that the county was beginning to wonder whether the good Duchess had not, perhaps, done rather well for herself in walking out of Oakmere, and might do better yet. Julian sat with that news in the cold library, and the great old fear rose up in him that he had left it too long, that his fine patient not reaching had merely given another man the room to reach, that he had done his penance too slowly and too well, and was about to lose her not to her anger, which he could have understood, but to her happiness, which he had wished on her with his whole heart, and which now might carry her forever out of his reach into some other man's warm house in the north. And it would be no more than justice, and it would kill him, and he sat there in the dark and understood at last, wholly, what he had thrown away at the Fanshawe ball for the pleasure of 3 dances and a cruel woman's smile. The tale of the Duchess's rise came south to Julian all that year in pieces, and he gathered every piece and turned it over and kept it, the way a man keeps letters from someone he loves, though these were not letters and she had sent him nothing. He learned that the little school in the Wexham barn had grown from a handful of ragged children to above 30, and that she had got a proper young schoolmaster in from Harborne to take the greater part of it, but that she still came herself 2 mornings a week to hear the youngest ones their letters, because she was reported to have said, "A child who is heard by someone who plainly cares whether he learns will learn twice as fast as one who is merely taught." And Julian, hearing that, thought of himself as a boy, taught by hired men who did not care and flattered by everyone who did, and understood a little more of why he had turned out as he had, and forgave the boy a little, and resolved that whatever children God might yet, against all likelihood, send him, they should be heard. He learned that she had settled a quarrel between 2 north farmers over a watercourse that had festered for a generation and gone to law twice, and beggared both families in attorney's fees, and had settled it in an afternoon, sitting between the 2 stubborn old men at her own scrubbed table with a jug of cider, by the simple expedient of listening to each of them longer than anyone had ever troubled to listen before, and then proposing a thing so fair and so plain that both were ashamed they had not thought of it in 30 years, and that the 2 families who had not spoken since the last century now sat together in church. He learned that she had begun to be sent for, quietly, from beyond the Oakmere lands, by other people's tenants and even by other people's gentry, to advise on this and heal that and reconcile the other, and that there was beginning to be, along the whole northern march of the county, a settled understanding that if a thing were truly wrong and truly needed mending, the person to send for was the Duchess of Oakmere up at Wexham, who would come and listen, and not spare herself, and ask nothing. And Julian, gathering all this, felt the strangest mingling of pride and grief that a man can feel. Pride, fierce, helpless, useless pride, that this extraordinary woman was, in the eyes of church and law, and his wife, still bore his name, was the Duchess of his house. And grief that he had had her under his own roof, this rare good creature, for 2 whole years, and had seen none of it, had let all this light burn behind a closed parlour door, while he chased the cold glitter of Camilla Vane, and had driven it 4 hours north before he learned to look. The pride and the grief did not cancel. He carried both, and they made him quiet, and the quiet made him better company, and so even his grief was turned, by that strange alchemy of a year rightly suffered, to some small good. The county's talk of him and of her changed shape across that year, as talk does. At first, in the weeks after the ball, it had all run one way: a proud duke, a slighted wife, a scandal, a 9 days' wonder. But the wonder did not die in 9 days, as such things usually did, because the 2 people at the centre of it would not behave as scandal requires. The wife did not weep or rage or flee to her family or take a lover, or do any of the interesting things a wronged wife is supposed to do. She went quietly north and made herself indispensable, which is the least scandalous thing imaginable, and yet, done in those circumstances, the most compelling. And the husband did not bluster or defend himself or flaunt the other woman or sink into dissipation. He turned away the other woman before all London, and went quiet and grew good, and refused to be thanked for it. The county did not know what to do with a scandal in which both parties behaved so well, and so it did the only thing it could, which was to fall slowly and half against its will into a kind of respect for them both, and to begin telling the story not as a scandal at all, but as something rarer and finer, which it did not have a name for, and which came in time to be simply the story of the Duke and the good Duchess. At the Harborne Fair, when they met in the square, Julian felt all this hanging in the air around them, the whole watching county, holding its breath to see what these two extraordinary people would do, and he had felt her feel it too, and it had made the meeting almost unbearable. 4 feet of muddy cobble with 100 souls willing them together, and she had called him Julian and coloured and looked at him long and gone, and he had ridden home hoping and forbidding himself to hope, and the county, watching, had begun that very evening, over its cider and its fires, to whisper the question that would ripen all winter into the Marchmont rumour, whether the good Duchess might take her husband back, or where, being now so much sought after, she might do better and leave him to the loneliness he had earned. The county was divided on it, and laid small wagers, and could not decide, because the county could not tell any better than Julian could what was in the grave heart of the woman up at Wexham, who listened to everyone and confided in no one, and kept an empty peach basket on a high shelf for no reason she would give. He did not sleep that night. He walked the long gallery of Oakmere Court in the dark, up and down before the dead Ashcombs, and fought the hardest battle of his changed life, which was the battle between the two things he now knew to be true and could not reconcile. The first was that he loved her, and that if he did not go to her now at once and lay his heart at her feet, he might lose her forever, and the whole animal part of him screamed to ride north through the December dark and reach her before Marchmont could. The second was the thing his long penance had taught him, the thing that was the very proof he had changed it all, that she was free, that she had bought her freedom with her own dignity and grief, that if she chose Marchmont or chose no one, or chose to be happy forever apart from him, that was her right, wholly and entirely hers, and that for him to ride north and press his claim now in a panic, to try to secure her before she could choose otherwise, that would be the old Julian exactly, the grasping man, the man who took what he wanted because he wanted it, the man of the ball. To go now to save himself would be to prove he had never really changed at all. He walked the gallery until the black windows greyed, and by dawn he had found, at terrible cost, the answer, and the answer was the hardest thing his year of hard things had asked of him. He would go to her, not to plead, not to claim, not to secure himself, but to set her formally and finally free. He would ride to Wexham and tell her, in plain words, that she owed him nothing, that she was released from every claim he had ever pretended to have on her, that if she wished the marriage dissolved he would arrange it and take all the blame and all the scandal upon himself, and see her settled and safe and rich and free to make whatever life she chose, with Marchmont or without him, and that he asked for nothing in return, nothing at all, except her pardon, which she might withhold, and her leave to go on being, at a distance and forever, a better man for having known her. He would give her, at last, the one thing he had never given her in the whole of their marriage, her own freedom, whole, with no string on it, no claim, no reaching. And whatever it cost him, and it would cost him everything, he would mean it. That was the only declaration worth making. It was the opposite of the declaration the old Julian would have made, and that was how he knew it was true. He rode north the next morning through a hard, bright frost, alone, no servant, no state, in a plain coat, and reached Wexham at the middle of the short day. The little grey house sat among bare trees in the low winter sun, smoke rising straight from its chimneys in the still cold, and it looked, Julian thought, drawing rein at the gate, more like a home than Oakmere Court had ever looked in all its grandeur. And he understood why she had been happy there, and his heart failed him for a moment at the gate. Then he got down and gave his horse to the astonished old Coombes, who came out from the stable and stared at the Duke of Oakmere standing at the Wexham gate in a plain coat as though the sky had fallen, and Julian walked up the frozen path to the door of the house where his wife had made her life without him, and knocked, and waited. And it was the longest wait of his life. Bessie opened the door and went white and dropped a curtsy and stammered that she would see if her Grace was at home, and Julian said gently, "Tell her I will wait as long as she likes, and that if she does not wish to see me she has only to send word and I will go, and there will be no offence, and I will not come again." And he waited in the little cold flagged hall, hat in hand, and heard low voices somewhere within, and then a door, and then Eleanor came. She came into the hall in a plain house gown of dark blue wool, with a shawl about her shoulders and her sleeves pushed up, for she had been at some work when he came, and there was a smear of green on her wrist from the physic garden or the still room, and Julian looked at her. The pushed-up sleeves, the smudge on her wrist, the grave grey eyes wary now and guarded, and thought he had never in his life seen anything he wanted so much or deserved so little, and he did not say any of that, because it was not what he had come to say. Julia, she said, not your grace. His name. But her voice was careful. You are the last person I expected at my gate. Is something wrong at the court? Are you ill? Nothing is wrong at the court, he said. I am not ill. I am Eleanor. I have come to say a thing to you, and then I will go. And I have made myself rehearse it plainly, because I know that my fine speeches are the thing you have most reason to distrust. And I do not want to be fine, I want to be true for once before you, and it may be the last time, so I beg you will let me say it badly and to the end. She looked at him a long moment. Then she said, Come and sit down. It is cold in the hall, and led him into a small warm parlour where a fire burned and a work-basket sat open and the winter sun came slanting in gold across a scrubbed table, and she did not offer him tea, which he understood. This was not a visit, and they both knew it. But she gave him a chair by the fire and took one herself across from him, and folded her stained hands in her lap, and waited, grave and still, for him to say his piece. And Julian, sitting in the warm parlour of the house where his wife had grown into herself without him, said the hardest and truest words of his life. I have heard, he began, that the Marchmonts think well of you, and that young Marchmont is much here, and that the county wonders whether you might not, in time, do better for yourself than the husband you left. He saw her go still, saw a faint colour and could not read it, and pressed on before his courage failed. I did not come to plead against that, Eleanor. I want you to understand that first, before anything else, because everything I have to say depends on it. I did not come to ask you to come back to me. I have no right to ask it, and I am done, I hope forever, with taking what I have no right to. I came to tell you that you are free, wholly free. If you wish the marriage ended, I will end it. I will take every particle of the blame, before the courts and the county and the world. I will let them say of me whatever is true, which is bad enough, and worse besides if it will spare you. I will see you settled in your own lands with your own fortune and your own good name unstained, free to make whatever life you choose, with any man you choose, or with no man, only yourself and your people and your school and your garden, which I think perhaps you love better than you could ever love any man, and no one would blame you. He drew a breath that shook. I came to give you your freedom. It is the one thing I never gave you in 2 years of marriage, and it is the only thing I have that is worth giving, and I give it to you now with no string upon it, no claim, nothing owed. That is all. That is what I came 4 hours through the frost to say. The fire cracked in the grate. Eleanor sat very still, and her folded hands had tightened in her lap, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in the whole of their acquaintance, and could not read, and dared not hope about. And is that all you came to say? She asked at last, very low. No, said Julian, and his voice broke on it, and he let it break and did not try to mend it. God help me, it is not all, but it is all I have the right to say, and so it is all I will say except this one thing more, which you may do with as you please. I love you, Eleanor. I did not know what the word meant when I married you, and I did not know it at the ball, and I have spent a year and more learning it, alone, in an empty house, from your absence, which taught me better than your presence ever could, because I had been too proud to learn from your presence. I love you. I do not say it to move you. I say it because it is true, and you have a right to the truth from me, at last, whatever you do with it. And now I have said it, and I will go, and you need never see me again unless you send for me, and I will not send for you ever, because you are free, and freedom is the whole of what I have to give. He rose. He was shaking. He had said it all badly as he had promised, and it was true. All of it, and there was nothing left in him, and he reached for his hat where he had set it on the table, and he could not look at her, because if he looked at her he would break entirely, and so he looked instead at the winter sun on the scrubbed table, and made her a bow. Not the Duke's grand bow, but a low, plain, unguarded bow, the bow of a man with nothing left to protect, and turned to go. Julian. He stopped at the parlor door with his hand on the latch. He did not turn at once, because he did not trust what his face would do, and because he had promised himself he would not reach, would not hope, would not grasp at the smallest sound as a drowning man grasps. "Julian, sit down," said Eleanor. And there was a thing in her voice now that had not been there before, a tremor under the quiet, and he turned and saw that his grave, still wife had risen from her chair, and that her hands, those stained, capable hands, were pressed together at her breast, and that her grey eyes were bright. Too bright, and that whatever she was holding in was very great, and very near the surface, and he stood in the doorway and did not dare to move. "You have made a mistake," she said. "You have made two, and the second is the worse. The first is that you think young Marchmont has come courting. And he has not. He has come, poor foolish boy, to consult me about drainage and his mother's rheumatism, and whether he ought to marry the Harborne attorney's daughter, whom he loves and is afraid of, and I have been advising him to be brave. And the whole county has built a romance out of it, because the county cannot see a man and a woman in a room without one. A breath, half a laugh, wholly unsteady. There is no Marchmont, Julian. There was never any Marchmont. I do not want the Marchmont's great house. I never wanted a great house. You gave me the greatest house in the county, and I was more alone in it than I have ever been in my life." She stopped and steadied herself and went on, and now the tremor was in all of it. "And the second mistake, the worse one, is that you came here to give me my freedom as though I did not already have it. Julian, I took my freedom. I did not wait for you to give it to me. I walked out of the Fanshawe ball, and I took it with my own two hands, and I have had it a year and more, and I have used it, and I know now exactly what it is worth and exactly what it cannot buy. It cannot buy the thing I have missed every single day in that pretty happy house you are so glad I have been happy in. I have been happy here, Julian. I told you the truth in the square. I would not lie to you. I have been useful and loved and free and happy, and underneath all of it every day, in the part of me no drainage and no school and no garden could reach, I have been missing my husband, not the man at the ball. I did not miss him for 1 hour. I was well rid of him. I have been missing the man who wrote me no letters and sent me no jewels, and instead went out and mended the almshouse and sat up with a dying shepherd, and turned away that woman before the whole of London, and changed the flowers in the hall with his own hands. I heard of it all, Julian. Everything, the whole year. It all came north to me along the lanes, just as my doings went south to you, and I sat here in this parlour and heard my husband becoming, a year too late and 4 hours too far away, the man I could have loved with my whole heart, and I did not dare to hope it was true. Because I had hoped before, at the beginning, and been made a fool of. Julian had let go the latch. He had come 1 step into the room. He did not remember doing it. "So I did the thing you did," said Eleanor, and now the tears were on her face, and she let them fall and did not wipe them. "I waited. I would not reach for you either. I thought, if it is true, if he has truly changed, then he will not come here grasping. He will not come to snatch me back the moment another's shadow falls across me. If he has truly changed, he will leave me free even at the cost of losing me. And Julian, that is exactly what you have just done. You rode 4 hours through the frost to give me away, to set me free into another man's arms and ask nothing back. Do you understand what you have shown me? Do you understand that there is not one thing you could have said or done in all the world that would have proved you changed as completely as the one thing you just came here to do?" Her voice broke entirely. "You great, blind dear, reformed fool, you have proved it. You have proved it past any doubt I had left, and now I am going to do the reaching, because I have earned the right to, and because I am not too proud to want the thing I want, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I want to stop being free of you." And the Duke of Oakmere, who had come north to give his wife away, crossed the small warm parlour in 3 strides and took her stained capable hands in both of his and went down, before her, on his knees on the scrubbed floor with the winter sun falling gold across them both, and pressed her hands to his bowed forehead and could not speak at all, and Eleanor stood over him with the tears running down and freed one hand and laid it in his dark hair, gently, the way she had once laid her hand on the fevered Barlow child. And Julian felt that touch go through him like the first warmth after a year of frost, and knew himself at last forgiven and understood in that moment that he had not won her back, that no man could win such a woman, that she was not a prize to be won, but that she had, of her own free choice, with her own clear eyes open to everything he was and everything he had been, chosen to come home, and that this was a gift so far beyond his deserving that he could do nothing with it but kneel and hold on, and mean to spend the rest of his life becoming worthy of the moment. "I do not deserve this," he said at last into her hands. "No," said Eleanor, and there was the old dry gentleness in it, mended now with tears. "You do not. But you have stopped acting as though you did, and that, my love, has turned out to be the whole of it. Get up off my clean floor. You are 33 and a duke, and there is green from my herbs all over your good coat." He got up. He did not let go of her hands. They stood close in the small warm room, and for a moment neither of them knew quite what came next, after so long, after so much, and Julian, looking down into the grave face he had learned at such cost to see, did the simplest thing, the thing he had not done in longing since the earliest days of their marriage. He lifted one of her hands, the one with the smudge of green on the wrist, and he turned it. And he pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, over the smudge, slowly, reverently, the way a man drinks who has been a long time in the desert, and he felt her breath catch, and heard her say his name once more, very softly, in a voice with no wall in it at all, and that was all. And it was everything. They were married again, in a manner of speaking, though the law said they had never stopped. Eleanor did not give up Wexham. Julian would not have let her if she had wished to, for he had learned what the place was to her, and what she was to it. And so it was agreed between them, gravely, in that same parlour, over the tea she did at last consent to pour, that they would keep both houses, and be sometimes at grand cold Oakmere for the county's sake and Julian's duties, and sometimes at little warm Wexham for the school and the garden and the North tenants who loved her, and that the great house should learn to be more like the small one, and not the other way about. And Julian, who a year before could not have imagined caring where he lived so long as it was the grandest place in view, found that the happiest hours of his life were spent a plain grey dower house, helping his wife carry salves to the sick and hearing tenants' children stumble through their letters in a cold barn, and that grandeur, which he had worshipped his whole life, was the emptiest thing he knew, and that he had had to lose everything that mattered to learn it. The county talked, of course. The county always talked. But the story it told, in the end, was not the one it had begun to tell on the night of the Fanshawe ball. That night it had told a story of a proud duke and a slighted mouse of a wife, and had pitied her and half-mocked her and wondered how long she would bear it. The story it told now, and would tell for a generation over its winter fires, was a better one and a truer one, of the quiet duchess who had walked out of a ballroom with her head high and asked nothing and reproached no one, and had gone away into the cold north and made herself beloved, and had so unmade her careless husband by her mere absence and her mere goodness that he had torn himself down to the foundations and built himself again into a man fit to stand beside her, and of how, when he was at last that man, and had proved it by trying to give her up, she had chosen freely, with her whole clear heart, to take him back. It was agreed, at the Fanshawe fires and the Marchmont fires and along all the lanes of the north and the south, that the good Duchess had had the making of the Duke of Oakmere, and that he knew it, and that there had never been a man so grateful to have been so thoroughly undone. Old Lady Fanshawe, who was very old now and had known his mother, said the last word on it, as she seemed to say the last word on everything. She had them to dine the first winter they were reconciled, at the very house where it had all gone wrong. And she watched the Duke of Oakmere across her table watch his wife the whole evening, as though she were the only light in the room, and rise before the servants to fetch her shawl himself when she shivered, and defer to her judgment on the drainage and the school and the parish with a plain unforced respect that no husband in that county showed his wife. And at the end of the evening the old woman took Eleanor's hand at the door and patted it, and looked past her to the Duke, and said, in her carrying whisper, "Well, Oakmere, it seems someone taught you the difference at last." And Julian, standing in the doorway of Fanshawe Park with his wife's hand tucked warm and willing through his arm, where, a year and more ago, he had never once thought to place it, bowed to the old woman, low and glad, and said, "She did, ma'am. She taught me everything, and led his Duchess out to the carriage through the frost, and this time and every time after he handed her up first, and got him beside her, and the seat across from them stayed empty, because neither of them would sit apart from the other again, and the lamps burned, and the horses started, and they went home together through the cold bright dark to whichever house was theirs that night, which was, either of them would have told you, only ever the one the other was in. They did not go back to Oakmere at once. There was no need, and neither of them wished it, and so Julian stayed 3 days at Wexham, in the plain grey house that had made his wife, and they were, he thought afterward, 3 of the sweetest days of his life. Sweeter than any he had spent in all the grandeur of the court, and it was because there was nothing grand in them at all. He slept the first night in a small plain guest chamber under the eaves, for they were neither of them in any haste after so much to rush what had been so slow in mending. And in the morning he came down and found her already gone out, and followed the sound of children's voices to the barn that was her school, and stood in the doorway unseen, and watched the Duchess of Oakmere, on a low stool with a slate on her knee, hearing a small boy with a runny nose stumble through his letters, patient as a saint, her stained hands folded, her whole grave attention bent on the child as though nothing in the world signified but whether he got to the end of the alphabet. And Julian stood in the doorway of the cold barn with his heart too full to speak, and understood that he was looking at the thing itself, the needful thing, the thing the sermon had meant, the thing he had walked past 1,000 times behind a closed parlour door, and that he had it back, undeserved by grace, and he made himself a promise, the second great honest promise of his life, that he would never walk past it again. She saw him then, and coloured, and finished the boy's lesson without hurrying, and sent the children out to their dinner, came to him across the empty barn wiping the chalk from her fingers, and stopped before him, and neither of them quite knew what to say, being still new to this, and Julian said, because it was true, and because he had learned to say the true thing plainly, "I have never in my life seen anything I would rather look at than you with that slate on your knee. I have owned the finest pictures in the county. They are nothing to it." And Eleanor looked up at him, and her grey eyes filled, and she said unsteadily, "You would not have said that once. You would not have seen it to say." And he said, "No, I was blind. I'm not blind now. It cost a great deal to open my eyes, and I would not close them again for the world. And the first thing they ever truly saw was you. And I mean to spend what is left of my life looking." And she put her chalky hand up to his face, there in the cold barn, and he turned his head and kissed her palm, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and more than enough, for 2 people who had come so far the long way round. They walked out that afternoon among her people, the 2 of them together, and Julian watched the North tenants watch their Duke walk humbly at the good Duchess' side, and defer to her about the drainage and the school and the sick, and saw the worriness in their weathered faces turn slowly over the walk to something like acceptance, and then, from the boldest of them, to something like welcome, and he understood that he was being weighed by people whose good opinion could not be bought or commanded, only earned, and that his wife's people were the hardest and truest court he had ever stood before, and he set himself to earn them, patiently for her sake and for their own and at last for his, and in time, not that day, but in the seasons that came he did, the arrangement they made, over the tea and in the days that followed, held for the rest of their lives, and it was this, that Wexham should be as much their home as Oakmere, and by degrees rather more, that the school and the garden and the North tenants should never be given up, that Julian should carry into the great cold house all that he had learned in the small warm one, and make Oakmere, so far as such a pile of grandeur could be made, into a place where light burned behind open doors and the flowers were changed because someone loved to change them, and the piano played most evenings softly in the small parlour off the hall, and that he should sit in the small parlour while she played, every evening he could, in the chair by the door he had walked past 1,000 times, and listen, and never once take the music for granted again as long as he lived, and he kept that too. Of all the promises of his changed life, he kept the small ones most faithfully, having learned at such cost that it is the small daily unregarded things that are the true measure of a love, and not the grand gestures, which are so often only vanity wearing devotion's coat. The piano was the thing that undid him, oddly, in the end, not at the reckoning, but after, in the ordinary happiness. The first evening they were home together at Wexham she played, and he sat in the chair by the door and listened, and it was a simple air, nothing grand. And he had heard her play it 100 times through a closed door in the first year of their marriage and never once gone in, and now he sat and heard it whole, in the same room, watching her hands, and something in him gave way entirely, and the Duke of Oakmere put his face in his hands and wept. Quietly, for all the music he had not heard and all the years he had wasted and all the near loss of the one needful thing, and Eleanor let the lost chord die, and came and knelt by his chair and put her arms about him and held him while he wept, and said nothing, because she understood. And because there was nothing to say, and because forgiveness, real forgiveness, does not need words, it only needs to be there, in the room, with its arms around you, when the weight of what you nearly threw away comes down on you at last. And when he was quiet again, she wiped his face with her chalky, garden-stained, capable hands, and smiled at him, and said only, "There, now you have heard it, shall I play it again?" And he said, "Yes, play it again, play it every night. I will never miss it again as long as I live." And she went back to the instrument and played, and he listened, and that was the shape of all their evenings ever after, and it was the shape of happiness, and he had had to lose everything to learn that happiness was so small and quiet a thing, and so easily walked past, and so precious past all the grandeur in the world. In the fullness of time there were children at Wexham and at Oakmere both, and Julian, who had been raised by hired men who did not care and flattered by everyone who did, heard his own children their letters himself, with a slate on his knee on a low stool, patiently, the way he had watched their mother do it in a cold barn on the day he came home, and he was there for them, present, unhurried, unmistakably caring, in a way his own father had never been for him. And it was perhaps the truest measure of how thoroughly Eleanor had unmade and remade him that his children grew up not knowing there had ever been another Julian Ashcombe, the careless one, the proud one, the one who paraded a mistress at a ball and let his wife walk out into the dark. That man was gone, undone by a quiet woman's dignity and a long hard year of honest grief, and the man who took his place and who grew old at his duchess's side, keeping both houses and both his great honest promises, would tell you himself if you asked him, as the county sometimes did ask him, growing bold with the years, that he owed everything he was and everything he had to the night his wife walked out of a ballroom without a word, and to the mercy, which he never ceased to marvel at, that she had chosen freely, when he had at last learned to leave her free, to walk back in.